sense of his craft, and also different fabrics and materials that could be used in really, really different ways.
The thing that I find very interesting is a lot of the time what Versace coupled was this idea of sex and celebrity. So you didn't even need clothes, but you knew it was Versace. You knew that was what Versace was selling you, and you knew that was what was embodied in his clothes as well. Versace wanted to appeal first and foremost to Italian consumers. There's an incredibly strong sense of Italy to what he was doing then and to what he did throughout his career. Gianni Versace was born in 1946 in Reggio Calabria in the south of Italy. That's incredibly significant because Versace's aesthetic ongoing has been seen as Southern Italian compared to his great 70s and 80s rival Armani, which was Milanese, northern, quite cold, minimal and precise. Reggio Calabria is quite close to Sicily. And so you get that whole idea of that mixing pot of different classical influences of different Italian cultures, but certainly a drive towards things that are more kind of exuberant and that are more sensual, that are more colourful, that are louder generally.
Gianni Versace was born into an upper middle class background, and he was very, very close with his siblings. It was a relatively comfortable upbringing in the South. He then was surrounded by these classical motifs of Roman and Greek ancient culture, and this went on to really inspire him.
His mother was a seamstress. She was very well known locally. She was apparently incredibly talented, and essentially her dressmaking business became more like a boutique in Reggio Calabria. So for Gianni, that was all part of growing up. It was tied intrinsically to fashion. The other thing that was important was Gianni's relationship with his younger sister, Donatella. He talked about her being his ideal woman. And from a very early age, he encouraged her to go out to nightclubs with him when she was underage. He got her to dye her hair blonde. He encouraged her to suntan. He encouraged her to dress provocatively. In a sense, he kind of lived out his early sort of fashion fantasies on his sister.
In the early 70s, Versace went to design for Jenny Callahan and Complice. And this was a really integral time for him. He actually ended up being hugely successful. These are the kind of textile brands that are put in front of kind of fabrication. And so he learnt, or should I say he exhibited great skill in working with different fabrics, leathers, knitwear, and it was very lucrative.
If you look now at the designs he was doing at Jenny, for instance, there is a huge connection to what he would do in the early 80s under his own label. I feel the difference is that Jenny was a little bit safer. There is a focus, for instance, on draped jersey, which is very much in the classical mold of Roman or Greek togas. But whereas it's elegant and sensual at Jenny, when Versace was designing under his own name, it became much more sexy, much more overtly sexy, much more powerful, much more forceful, much more emphatic. If you look at the tailoring he was designing at labels like Complice, you can see, you know, they have broad shoulders, they're incredibly technically advanced. You know, they're not really about the body, they're about creating these abstract shapes around the body, but then perhaps you'd remove the coat and you'd be wearing a slinky dress underneath. So really it's about this interplay of architectural construction and things cleaving incredibly close to the body.
When designing for these other labels, Versace decided that he could go out on his own, and spurred along by his brother Santo, who really was working on the business side of things, he felt that he had something to offer. So in spring-summer 1977, Versace tacked on a very small collection of his own designs into one of his other freelance jobs. And that really put the wheels in motion to him founding his own company.
Versace opened his first boutique in 1978 in Via della Spiga at the heart of Milan, which now is an incredible thoroughfare of all different luxury brands, but then was just beginning to be established. There was this kind of deal that textile manufacturers made with designers in the late 70s in Milan, which is that the textile manufacturers would foot the cost for establishing the labels in exchange for shares in the company. And it's something that worked incredibly well. That's why all of a sudden in the late 1970s you have an explosion of labels like Armani, like Versace. And really what that was all about was establishing Milan as a new fashion capital and establishing Milan as a competitor to Paris.
In 1979, Gianni Versace collaborated with Richard Avedon on what would be the first of many campaigns with the photographer.
Versace's work with Richard Avedon really defines so much of what is great about fashion image making. And the advertising campaigns that Avedon produced for Gianni Versace are some of the most iconic of all time. And the kind of risks and lengths that they went to get these amazing images were really extraordinary. For example, a young Kate Moss with messy hair on an advertising campaign by Avedon is really quite extraordinary when the whole reason for it is to sell the garments. And I think it was these pioneering decisions, bringing together these groups of iconic models shot in colour, which Avedon so rarely did, and you get these absolutely amazing shoots. And I think it was a celebration of the woman that they both shared, and I think that that's why it was a real marriage made in heaven.
The kind of remarkable images that they generated really helped cement not just the name Versace, but the whole identity of Versace, that it's this kind of decadent, incredibly potent, sexually driven idea of contemporary fashion. I think really what it ended up doing was making Versace's incredibly specific, incredibly southern Italian point of view look anything but provincial. The interesting thing with Versace's chainmail, which he invented in 1982, is that it's an example of a designer really seizing on new technologies and new materials, using them in an innovative way. Oroton was the aluminium chainmail that Versace discovered. It was actually used in jet plane manufacture. But when Versace came upon it, he realized that it was incredibly pliant and it could be easily made into clothes. And he cut incredibly sensuous, quite classical dresses in draped chainmail, that for him were referring back to the Renaissance, to medieval times, and they were remarkably successful. The Versace boutique on Rodeo Drive in the 1980s sold more metal mesh than the rest of the collection put together. Versace's relationship with Antonio Damiko was the longest lasting of his life. Damiko was involved in the fashion industry. He was a model originally, and then he became involved in the Versace house in various forms. But really the most important thing for Versace was that he had a partner, was that he had someone that was secure, and somebody that he could indulge as well. There's a great sense of kind of being able to indulge people. He also indulged his niece Allegra with gifts. But with Damiko, it's interesting that he emerges when Versace's starting to think about menswear, and he's starting to think about different ways of dressing men, different ways of exploring men's sexuality.
In 1985, to celebrate a study day on Gianni Versace at the Victoria and Albert Museum, they mounted a small exhibition in their costume court dedicated to the designer. And this was the first exhibition of his work in this country, in London.
I think what it reflected was his standing in the fashion world. It reflected the innovation that he'd already expressed even in a very short career. And it also expressed something that I think is in retrospect easily overlooked, which is how curators and art historians reacted to what Versace was doing. They were very excited by the fact that Versace's clothes had all of these allusions and references to high Renaissance art in them, that they really had this sense of classicism. I think we look at Versace, we think of Versace, we think of sex, we think of a certain aesthetic, whereas at that point in his career, Versace was viewed very differently. Versace was really quite revered as a sort of Italian sensualist.
In 1989, Versace opened his couture operations, Atelier Versace, in Paris.
It offered a realm without any kind of commercial restrictions. It offered a place where he was allowed to create things that were ostentatious and spectacular and didn't have to consider who the customer would be. In terms of French fashion, the importance of having a Milanese-based designer who still had an atelier in Milan coming and showing as part of Paris Haute Couture Week was very significant. I think it's quite interesting that the French establishment, the French Chambre Syndicale, who determine who is and who isn't allowed to show as part of Haute Couture Week, seem to welcome Versace.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
At the end of the 80s, start of the 90s, there is a shift in the way Versace presents his clothes. He does that through kind of various means. The invention, quote unquote, of the supermodels is a very interesting example. Gianni Versace was the first designer to pay models who subsequently became known as supermodels over the odds to appear in his shows. He was paying Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford and Christy Turlington upwards of $10,000 to appear exclusively in his shows in Milan.
This was a really important moment in defining the supers, the supermodels, the models who needed no surnames.
And then there was the memorable occasion for his winter 1991 collection when he sent those 4 supermodels down the catwalk mouthing along to George Michael's Freedom, which they'd just done in George Michael's Freedom video. So there was this moment where kind of MTV met fashion in a way that it really hadn't done ever previously.
This celebration of the supermodels became a real phenomenon that is very closely associated with Versace. He really kind of gave these women confidence, sass. The way in which they dressed were just so sexually kind of celebratory of their bodies, and that was Versace.
Really, what that moment was a big shift for fashion. It was a shift of fashion from being a very insider world, very cliquey, very kind of trade-orientated, and making it something that's much more about entertainment.
There's a great amount of work that was very much inspired by the classics, so Grecian and Roman history, and that was something that was really inspiring for Versace, but you can really see it appearing in his designs. These kind of motifs, even in his logo, the Medusa. I think that was something that was very ingrained in his visual aesthetic as a designer, but personal. And I think the research that he did to achieve that was really deep and integral.
Interestingly, that emerges in the 1980s when people are thinking about branding, when people are thinking about licensing and how to capitalize on a business, how to expand on a business. And I think Versace is very clever in that it's not about his name per se, but it's about these symbols that already have so much kind of cultural importance, that already carry so much weight. I think a lot of people focus on Versace's evening wear, but what Versace did with Daywear was also incredibly interesting. He really sexualized Daywear for women as well as for men. He added bondage straps, he cut things in leather. He was incredibly innovative in his use of leather throughout his career.
In 1992, Versace designed the costumes for Elton John's world tour.
Stage performers were drawn to Versace's clothes because they were flashy, because they were ostentatious, but also because Versace understood the way that a body moved in clothes. You know, he understood how to cut clothes so you were able to move freely in them, but also to create an impact. You saw various people being drawn to Versace's aesthetic, people like Elton John, like Prince, like Madonna, and a lot of them ended up appearing in Versace's advertising campaigns as well. And what that did was obviously to cement his relationship with them.
The things that the celebrities were wearing was really attuned and in fitting with what they were doing, their performances, this stage, this idea of a tour, a music video. And I think that was something that he really quite learned very early on and really played with throughout his career.
I think when Versace got his fashion Oscar from the CFDA, it was in 1993. And that's really when Versace's at the height of his powers. He's at the height of his powers, and he's also on a cusp when fashion is about to change. Grunge was just beginning to become influential. There was beginning to be a reaction against the supermodels. You saw the rise of, for instance, Kate Moss, who then was referred to as the superwave. But in 1993, what Versace was doing was emblematic of fashion as a whole. It was something that was influencing everybody. Fellow designers, the mass market, they were all looking to Versace to really kind of lead the way. The black dress that Liz Hurley wore for the 1994 Four Weddings and a Funeral premiere, it's interesting that I don't think I'm the only person that could reel off those facts. I think so many people have that dress and that date and that occasion embedded in their memory because it caused a furore like nothing really seen before.
Elizabeth Hurley has commented, if I hadn't have worn that dress, perhaps I would have had more serious roles in my acting career.
When you read about it, it was all incredibly accidental. You know, Liz Hurley wanted to borrow a dress. She knew a PR at Versace. She got in touch with them. They sent the dress over. She didn't think there was anything particularly spectacular about it. But really, what it was a great case of is this idea of the impact that Versace's clothing could have. Versace was one of a number of different kind of subsidiary lines that Versace launched. What Versace was really was a line that Gianni Versace gave to Donatella to experiment with. The idea being that it would be a younger line, that it would be a lower priced line. In the early 1990s, diffusion lines were something that every designer had. It was a way of capitalizing on the power of your aesthetic and the power of your name. The whole idea of it being that you could water down clothes that you've shown on the catwalk, produce them in simpler cuts, less expensive materials, and offer them to a wider market.
What we try to reach is a global village, the idea of fashion from all over the country being together.
Also, during this period of time, the Versace brand released fragrances alongside the Versace diffusion line. So really what they're doing here is creating this total identity for the Versace man or woman.
I've got to let you know.
In 1997, the fashion world was rocked by the news that whilst outside his home on Miami Beach, Gianni Versace was murdered in broad daylight.
Gianni Versace showed his winter 1997 haute couture collection in Paris. He then returned to Miami, where he spent a great deal of the year. And just a few weeks after he presented the collection, he was gunned down by Andrew Cunanan, who was a gay spree killer. The reaction to the death of Versace was quite remarkable, both from the world and from the fashion world. A number of designers attended his funeral. It was front page news across the entire world. And really what that kind of epitomizes is how Versace himself had become a celebrity.
Upon Gianni's death, the will that he left was made out to his 11-year-old niece to leave all his fortune to her. And then Santo and Donatella would continue his brand on.
What Donatella then did was to assemble a creative team around her to help her satisfy the demands of the business. But ultimately, it was very difficult, and she was relatively inexperienced. She had worked alongside her brother, but she'd never been the person determining the creative vision of the house. She'd always been kind of an accomplice rather than the kind of auteur. And I think that's reflected in a degree of uncertainty. You can see some collections that worked incredibly well. For instance, when Jennifer Lopez wore a kind of slit to the navel, palm print Versace dress that really kind of epitomised a certain fashion moment. But a lot of the collections were quite uneven.
There is a time of difficulty financially for them where they change CEOs 3 times. They also have to close and kind of regroup on the business side of things. So they closed a lot of shops at this period of time.
The other thing at that same time is when you look at a label like Gucci, who'd really emerged from nowhere in the mid-90s under Tom Ford and was treading on distinctly Versace territory. It was treading on these ideas of kind of sensuality, of sexuality, was doing it in a very different way. And a lot of that could make Versace look old-fashioned. Today, the interesting thing with Donatella Versace is the fact that she's really kind of rediscovered the identity of the House of Versace. When you speak with her, she actually pins this down to a 2011 collaboration with H&M. What that made her do was re-examine the archives, re-look at the signatures of Versace and really try and reiterate those for a new generation. And really kind of having weathered, you know, the waters of grunge and deconstruction and punk, what Versace has come back to is what Versace always was, which is this idea of kind of luxury and sexuality and opulence and dressing to look rich. I think Gianni Versace's legacy is that his fashion isn't just fashion, his fashion's become part of popular culture. The way that Versace projected himself beyond an industry that was at that point quite insular, the way that his name has become separated from the clothes, his name has become kind of redolent of a certain breed of luxury, a certain aesthetic.
The legacy of Versace is feeling quite strong with Donatella at the helm. In recent years, there's been a renewed sense of strength in the aesthetic, a really kind of revisiting, perhaps, at certain stages of what it means today and how it's relevant, and it really feels relevant.
The Supermodels were Gianni Versace's creation. This fusion of music and fashion was Gianni Versace's creation. And I think now, if you think of the House of Versace as being its legacy, the fascinating thing is that that's still what Versace's built around. Versace's still built around that fusion of music and fashion, that fusion of incredible physical beauty and fashion, this kind of aspirational model of fashion as something that we can all dream about.